The scary stories will start in 40 seconds. Before they do, I just want to remind you to subscribe to my channel. I always take extra time while editing to ensure that my narrations contain zero mistakes. And as always, this video has minimal ads. Only 2 mid-roll ads, and they are towards the beginning of the video, so that you can relax without being interrupted again for the rest of the video. So again, if you do enjoy these videos and want to show your support, all I ask is that you please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. Now, let's begin. So this is a story that happened to my mom's friend in Korea about 10 years ago. Every time I hear this story, I still get the chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the days. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter, and got onto the elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and yellow raincoat, and he kept his head low so that she couldn't really see his face. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand to her side, furthest away from the man. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was that when she pressed the button for her floor, there was no other lit number, and on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in her head, and she started to panic and decided to take out her cell phone and pretend that she was calling home to her husband, who was obviously really not at home and at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you get the door for me?" and was making it seem like her husband was waiting at home for her. When the elevator did reach her floor, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter and started to walk as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When my mom's friend got to her door, she started to bang on it and shout, "Hey, I'm home. Please open the door," and she kind of pretended like he was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in the yellow raincoat started to walk away back towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far enough away, my mom's friend quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode and started to frantically punch in her keycode. But the problem was that the buttons would make sounds, so the man knew that no one was going to answer the door. And he turned around and started to run back towards her. My mom's friend at this point was practically screaming, and when she finally got her door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter in through the door. When she got in herself, she saw that the man was inches away from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could get his hand or a weapon through the door. Afterwards, looking through the door's peephole, she saw that the man was walking away back towards the elevator. Several months later, my mom's friend was watching the news, and there was a coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yoo Young-chul, who used to kill prostitutes. She told my mom that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the too familiar yellow raincoat and hat that he was wearing when he was apprehended. I have always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night, and the safety that was offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 o'clock in the morning. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green, right when you finally decide to just run it. Of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there, and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking." And for whatever reason, that was the night that I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus stop bench. We made brief eye contact, and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew that she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed that she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me so that I could just get out of there, but I knew that there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on the glass. I nervously looked up at her, and she motioned for me to roll my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she did not seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said, "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny, and of indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was a 60-something-year-old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced and like she was disconnected from the moment. That made my skin crawl, and after a very brief debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and could not give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and repeated the same thing. "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" This time I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her that I had a curfew and had to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again. "My boyfriend beat me." At this point, the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light and then looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. "You made the right decision." Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and sped all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do, or if there were more people that were waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in, but that encounter has haunted me ever since, and has confirmed in my mind that all the worst things happen after dark. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about 1.5 hours west of Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from a paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter-mile north from the house, he built a small lake, more like a pond. It was about as long as a football field, but wider. To get to the lake from the house, you could take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane, and we named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest days, and it had a slight decline as you walked toward the lake. I say walked because this trail was not for vehicles. Thick woods filled the area outside and in between both trails. One morning during the fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and to do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or two. I was 10 years old, so I decided to go fishing. I carried my pole, small radio, and my small ice chest. I had our dog named Bully with me that never left my side, and it was on this day I realized how awesome he really was. On to the lake we went. Vampire Lane opened up to a more severe decline to the shore, and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side, there was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. The north side of the lake there was a dam, and the south ended in thick and swampy woods. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I have come to recognize well, and it may have saved my life this day. The feeling of being watched by something dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later, I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west, to the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake. I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately my eyes lit on what I thought to be a half silhouette of a large man behind a tree. It was too far to make out details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. Almost 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for an overactive imagination, the half silhouette moved behind a tree slowly. Bully stood up and growled louder, and I told him quietly to stop, and I turned my head north towards the dam while keeping my eyes and attention rooted at the tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure moved slowly from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying "scared stiff" was something I found to be true. For some reason, I thought it important that whoever it was did not know I was aware. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path to me shorter and easier. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole and started walking towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the Army for 11 years as an MP, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that walk was the hardest thing I have ever done. In my mind's eye, whoever it was sprinting across the dam towards me. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped some 20 yards ahead and faced north until I passed him. He continued this action the entire run home. My dog was watching my back. It was epic. Although I can grasp the awesomeness of this now, at the time, I was so scared I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep up on a 10-year-old boy was up to no good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front window, my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly after, and for some reason, I did not mention what happened. I never felt safe there again. When me and my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure that my parents were with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact that our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between as the crow flies. Who was the man that was watching me from the woods that day? I will never know. I sometimes wish I could go back, as a grown man with military training, and see him again. Bully lived a full life and was put to sleep peacefully as a very old but great dog. The best dog that I have ever known. Back in 2008, I was planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff that I could put on my entry applications. I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill, with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point, when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the bushes to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or early 80s. He was very pale, liver spots dotting his face, and a partially gray and white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought of seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes and those weather conditions was, this guy has lost his mind. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving an inch, and then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, and then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so we continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down, and the slope was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanning for perhaps 50 feet or more, and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given that there were no shrubs or roots to hold on to, or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering, how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly? I mean, at that distance, it is hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear, he still did not appear to be wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath he said, "There's something wrong." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services for help, and that professional help would be on its way soon, that they would have all the tools to help him. The old man suddenly got furious, and he began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now, or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling his words. His hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my entire life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets. His skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police so that we could show them where we encountered the old man. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction that the old man led us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man that we encountered. One of the weirdest experiences of my life. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates, stories of cult activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of stuff that you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences, admittedly, had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses, surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail, with several smaller trails that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate at the base of a steep hill, adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. We parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead. It was about 1 a.m. at this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided that it was time to set up his first shot, while my other friend Jeff and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot that he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and went off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop, about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it as the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave toward the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment, while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch, just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it's around 3 a.m. Dave decides that he's got all the shots that he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we were preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Completely terrified, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the water tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail, not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he had been out there the entire time that we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we ran like hell down the canyon and back to our campus, just in time for class. Who knows what they would have done if they had caught us. Hey, this is Being Scared. I hope you're enjoying Volume 48, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. I always put maximum effort into my videos, always with minimal ads. Alright, back to the stories.
I didn't really like my stepdad. He wasn't a bad guy, I just didn't know him very well. And he took my dad's place, which didn't really sit well in my head or my heart. You see, my dad died while exercising one day. He was an avid jogger. He seemed so healthy to everyone, but the next thing we knew, an ambulance was driving down the street, racing to my dad's lifeless body. I believe it was an aneurysm. Not really sure what caused it, though. A couple of years later, my mom, being lonely, found someone new, someone I didn't want to accept. Craig was a nice guy. He was in his early 50s, loved playing video games with my brother and sister, and he took every opportunity he had to try to bond with me. But I wasn't ready to open up yet. Not even when my mom offered that the two of us take a weekend to go hiking in the mountains. She'd been wanting Craig to get more in shape. He wasn't nearly as in shape as my dad. Then again, neither was I. But I did enjoy the outdoors. Craig obliged, but I was hesitant. Imagining just how awkward it was going to be, just me and Craig out in the woods. It didn't sound too fun. One night when my mom pulled me aside after dinner, she begged me to go with him. I was 17 years old, and I would be graduating next year, moving out of state for college. She dreaded the idea of the two of us not knowing each other very well, not getting along. So, to make her happy, we began planning a trip to the mountains. It was nearly fall, right before school started back up. We were carrying big bags, equipped with a tent, some flashlights, batteries, fire starters, because we weren't going to be able to do that castaway style. Craig had also gone shopping and bought some MREs and a bunch of astronaut treats, those freeze-dried ice cream bars and candy bars and such. He thought it'd be fun to pig out on them the first night, after we got a camp set up, of course. To be quite honest, seeing him so excited to go hiking with me, it really helped me loosen up on the trip. We soon pulled up at the start of the hiking trail on a Friday evening. It was a couple of hours until sundown, but there were plenty of places along the trail to camp at, so we weren't worried about not being able to find a spot fast enough. As we were unloading the gear from the truck, another truck pulled up next to us. A father and his two sons who appeared to be going fishing down by the nearby river. As the two of us got started along the trail, I looked back one last time before the trees enveloped my view of the parking lot. I saw the father and the kids unloading some fishing rods. When the father asked the kid, who appeared to be his oldest, or biggest, son, to grab the tackle box under the back seat. By then, the trees around us had overtaken our view. It was now just us and nature, and a slowly reddening sky. After about 15 minutes of a walk, we ended up setting camp in a small clearing, which sat several yards to the right of the trail. If any other hikers happened to walk by and turn their head, they'd be able to see us pretty clearly. The two of us fumbled with getting the tent set up, eventually laughing each time we failed to do so. When we managed to rig it in a way that it wouldn't fall, we collapsed on the ground, tired, and getting pretty hungry. Craig whipped out 2 astronaut ice cream sandwiches from his backpack, tossing one at me. It was a Neapolitan flavor. You know, strawberry, vanilla, then chocolate. It was dry as heck, as expected, but really delicious. I see some kindling back there not too far behind you. Won't you grab it? We'll get a fire going. Craig requested. I nodded and did as he asked. I brought back a mess of twigs. We made a slight hole in the ground and put the twigs inside. He poured some lighter fluid on it and set it ablaze. Then slowly, one by one, he piled on some small logs, until there was a full-blown fire before us. He began to pull out 2 of those collapsing camping chairs. We'd brought those along too, though I think he was regretting it. Carrying just one of those heavy and awkwardly sized things was a bit much, especially for a long hiking trip. But at least we'd have something to sit down on that wasn't dirty or wooden. He passed me the light blue, and he sat down in a lime green. With a big sigh, he asked me, "How you holding up so far?" I swatted at a gnat or mosquito or something on my neck, then answered, "I love being out here, but never really went camping much." "Well, you probably can't tell," Craig said, smacking his beer belly, then laughing. "But I'm no outdoorsman either. So, what you hungry for? Beef stew or chicken soup?" He pulled out a couple of MRE bags, then dangled them in front of me to let me choose. Your choice," I answered, not really knowing what to say. I'd never really had an MRE before, and I wasn't too sure they'd be very good. "Beef stew it is." He placed the other bag back in the backpack, then carefully began to read the immense instructions on the back of that bag. After watching him for way too long trying to figure it out, he finally managed to get the bag to the point where the food was heating up inside. We had to sit a couple more minutes before it was done. There was an awkward silence for a while. I think Craig was trying to figure out what to say to me. And to be fair, I didn't know what to say to him either. Suddenly, he blurted out, "So, how's school been? Got a particular girl in your life?" I smirked. I don't know why, but him asking me that, it made me feel irritated. Sure, hiking along the way here and chatting it up and cooperating has been fine for me. But I think it was because those activities weren't exclusive to a father and son. But when he asked me about school, it reminded me of how my dad would ask how school was after I'd come home, and I didn't like that. This may sound immature and even mean, but it made me feel like he was pretending to be my dad, but he wasn't. In my head, he was not my dad. He was just a strange man who met my mom, and they happened to get along together. I felt forced to know him, and now I felt forced to bond with him. Looking back on this now, I feel so bad. But back then, my head was filled with anger, rebellion, and the only thing I could think to say was, "That's not your business, Craig." "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I understand, but..." Craig apologized swiftly, his sincerity stumbling out as words I couldn't piece together. Eventually, he caught up with himself and breathed in real deep. "What I meant to say was, I know, maybe that was a personal question. Well, I want to be your friend first. I know I'll never be your dad. I know that. But I do want to be your friend. Is that okay?" I suddenly felt guilt for reacting the way I did, but that was soon replaced with feeling embarrassment for myself. I felt stupid, and I felt awkward. I wasn't ready for the sudden heart-to-heart. I began to stand up, when suddenly, something landed right in front of us, landing right on the fire and putting it out all at once. I fell back into my chair, and Craig shouted. The two of us looked down at the campfire together, and there we saw the strangest thing. There was no trace of the dark object we saw briefly fall between us. There was no trace of an impact on the fire either. Instead, the fire was out. Well, it wasn't out, actually. It was as if it had never been started. The hole was there that we dug for the fire, and my kindling was waiting to be lit. There was no trace of the twigs being burned. As a matter of fact, the small logs that Craig had placed in the fire were now gone. "What in the world?" he said, then turned around where he'd kept the logs. "Oh my God," he muttered. "What? Craig, what is it?" I was feeling a bit nervous then. Without turning around, he instead beckoned me with his hand. I came over and looked over his shoulder. There on the ground was each and every log he had found and gathered, including the ones he had placed in the fire. They'd somehow returned to their spot behind him, and were not charred or burnt at all. How is that possible?" I asked. "You're asking me? I've got no idea," he admitted. "It's like a glitch in the Matrix, I guess." I think he was trying to make light of the situation. It wasn't really scary. It was just really confusing, because neither of us had any idea what had just happened. Soon after that, we prepared the tent and got ready to go to sleep. As we got cozy in our sleeping bags, just when things were supposed to get quiet, we instead heard a noise in the distance, sounding like it was coming from above us, like it was coming from the sky. The noise was like a metallic hum. It was one note, playing slowly for the next hour. We sat there listening to it, wondering what it could be from. I guessed it was a plane or something, but there weren't any airports or bases near us. If it was a plane flying overhead, it would have been long gone in a couple of minutes. Craig made a joke about it being just a really weird bird. I didn't know how to reply. He eventually fell asleep, and after several more minutes of confusion, I was too tired to keep my eyes open. In the morning, we packed up, heading further up the trail. The plan was to make it to the peak and then go back down, camping another night before going home. But plans be damned. We never did make it to the peak. 3/4 of the way up, the humming sound we'd heard in the sky the previous night came again. This time, it was ahead of us. Not above us at all, but ahead of us. Like, if we kept walking, we'd run into it, whatever it was. With curiosity, we kept going, albeit more slowly than before. At the next bend in the trail, I stepped around the corner first and stopped. It took everything I had just to keep breathing. "Oh my God," I said, and Craig came rushing up to me, asking what was going on. But then he was breathless too the next second. Ahead of us, where the canopy in the trees opened up just above the trail, hovered 3 vortexes. They're hard to describe. They were these black voids sort of spiraling and swirling in on themselves. Each of them hovered a few feet off the ground. I was so awestruck and dying for an explanation for these things that it took me a minute or two to notice the dead deer on the ground. It was a buck. It seemed to have been freshly killed by something. Its midsection was all torn up. They began to descend, these vortexes, onto the carcass. Must have taken them a couple more minutes to do so. They descended so slowly. All the while, Craig and I were dead silent. When these black, spinning things made contact with the deer's body, a great wind began to well out from it, pushing us back. We struggled to keep our footing, and we looked on, trying to see what was going to happen. The 3 black objects suddenly formed together and disappeared instantly. There was no flash of light, no sudden blackout, nothing like that. They were just gone. Maybe we just couldn't comprehend how they left. But looking back on the trail, the deer's carcass was gone. There were no signs of a struggle in the dirt, no markings at all that the things could have left, no sign of a great wind. Craig, in utter disbelief, ran over to where the deer had been laying before. He was pawing at the ground, muttering, "It doesn't make sense. How is that possible?" before looking back at me. I don't think it's safe here, he confessed. Suddenly, there was a deep snort or huff to the left of us. I ran over to Craig, a bit scared, and stood next to him. We both faced the woods and saw a buck standing there, perfectly healthy. The horns and that color of fur, they looked the same as the deer that had just been lying on the ground. Its ears twitched at the sound of a twig snapping nearby. Before I could see what it was coming from, Craig had grabbed me by the arm and told me to run. I kept looking back, though, as we did so. The deer had begun to run as well, but a large cat, a mountain lion I think, had fallen down onto it and was now tearing into its midsection. Tearing into it at the exact same spot we'd found its carcass before. We were running down the trail now. We need to go home. I don't think it's right here. I'm really sorry. I was having fun. He looked at me, out of breath, and as if asking permission, he said, maybe we can do something else sometime soon. Would that be okay? I swallowed hard, and I nodded. We started to slow down. We were exhausted now, and it was almost dark again. I'm not sure where we are, Craig said. I've got no idea how close we are to the bottom. I sighed. I don't either. And I really don't want to get lost. Maybe we should set up camp again. We could keep going in the morning. Craig thought it over for several seconds. I may have suggested it, but I had no idea if it was the right decision. He didn't know what the black things were, or if they were even alive. Didn't know if they were dangerous. We just felt weird about the whole thing. Yeah, you're right. We'll stay another night, and in the morning, we'll find our way back down. We set up the tent again. We were much more efficient this time. We got some firewood and had a fire going pretty quick. This time the fire was much bigger. Guess we both had a newfound fear of the dark out here. We didn't say anything to each other the rest of the night, and when we went to bed in the tent, we made sure not to put the fire out this time. We just had to have a nightlight. Before we went to sleep, though, there was one thing said. From his sleeping bag, Craig said to me, "Good night. I'll make sure to get you home safe tomorrow, I promise." Once again, that feeling of being told something that my dad should be telling me came over me. A bit of anger bubbled to the top, and I couldn't help but reply, "I'm not your responsibility, you know. You don't even have to be here." Craig didn't say anything after that, but I could feel that he wanted to. He just didn't know what to say. And just as before, I immediately felt guilt and embarrassment. Until I fell asleep and kept repeating in my head, I shouldn't have said that. I woke up in the middle of the night, and as soon as I heard what had woke me up, my eyes grew wide. It was the humming sound again. It was close, but quiet. I sat straight up and reached over to wake up Craig, but his sleeping bag was empty. When I turned to face the entrance to the tent, the flap was open. I slowly poked out my head, and I looked around. Didn't take me long to see that Craig was standing just beyond the campfire. He seemed to be staring at something, and when I felt a powerful gust of wind around me, I got out of the tent and I called out towards Craig. "Are you all right?" I asked. He didn't reply or move. I ran up to him and grabbed him by the shoulder, but he didn't budge. And then I saw what was before him. A large black vortex, another one, but bigger than any we'd seen yet, and Craig had reached out his hand to touch it. Just before it made contact, I tried to blurt out, to tell him to stop. I was even a second away from yanking on his shoulder to separate him from the thing, but it was too late. He touched it. The vortex disappeared, and Craig was gone. One moment, I felt his warm shoulder under my palm, and the next moment, I was latching on to nothing but the night air. Tears welled in my eyes, and then I remembered before. When this happened at the campfire, the logs had just appeared where they were, and when it happened to the deer had reappeared where it had been. I ran around the campsite, but Craig was not there. I ran up and down the trail for 20 yards or so, but Craig was nowhere to be seen. I went back to the campsite and crawled into the tent just to check, and there he was. Craig was in his sleeping bag, but his eyes were wide open, and they were looking straight up. "Craig, are you okay?" Craig didn't even blink. From the movement of his sleeping bag, his chest rising and falling underneath, I knew he was alive, but he wasn't responsive. I waved my hand in front of his eyes, trying to get him to flinch, to blink, to respond in some way, but he wouldn't budge. Worried and morbidly curious, I crawled up right next to him, looked him in the eye, and slowly lowered my finger. I must have been only a millimeter away from touching his eyelid when I pulled my finger back. He wasn't going to respond to me. It was like he was catatonic. I was crying full on now, tears dripping onto Craig's sleeping bag. I kept calling out to him, even shook him, but nothing would happen. What had he done? Why did he touch that thing? And the last thing I said to him, I told him he didn't have to be here. Guilt had risen up in me more than ever before. I packed up everything, then searched Craig's bag for a cell phone. He hadn't brought one, because he didn't want any distractions from spending time with me. And I didn't have one because I'd simply forgotten to bring it. Great. When all that was left to pack up was the tent and Craig's sleeping bag, which I obviously wasn't able to, I tried to pick him up, but he was bigger than me. I tried to drag him, but that wasn't going to work. I hated the idea of it, but I knew that if I was going to get help, I'd have to leave him here. I tossed more logs in the fire, making sure that he would have plenty of light and warmth. I zipped up his tent real well, so that nothing could get inside. Before I walked down the trail, leaving him in the small clearing, I looked back. Then I whispered, "I'm sorry." I took off running down that mountain, but the trail seemed longer than it had before. I ran and ran, tumbling a few times at the weight of my backpack. Soon it was sunrise, letting me know that I'd been running for literally hours, even though the trip up to the highest point, where we'd found the deer, had taken no less than 3 or 4 hours of hiking. How could I have run several hours straight downhill and not be at the bottom? There was something truly wrong with this place, and I was soon struggling with the idea that I might not ever make it back. Soon the sun was high in the sky, and I was still running. I had no idea where I was getting the energy. I must have been crying the entire night. My eyes and my cheeks were sore, where tears had fallen and dried up. My face felt like a swollen mess. Just when I thought I was going to give up, I landed on a straightened and familiar part of the trail. I looked up, straight ahead, where I would have expected the trail to end. But what I saw was different. There was darkness. A wall of sheer black, a black that seemed to swirl in on itself, a black that gave off a strong wind. I looked left and right. This black wall seemed to extend for as far as I could see between the trees. I walked close to it. I followed it to the left for several meters. Still all darkness. I came back to the trail I was on, then went right. And again, nothing but black wall. like the blackness itself was shielding me from exiting the mountain. I came back to the trail, and I looked at it. There was only one way we were going to get off this mountain. I had to make it through. I took in a deep breath, and I swallowed down hard. I grabbed onto my backpack straps, as if they were lifelines. I closed my eyes, and I began to approach the black wall. My breathing became frantic, and my footsteps became less sure, but I kept going. One step. The already strong wind got even more rough, as if it was trying to pry open my eyelids, but I kept them closed. 2 steps. The wind was so strong against my face, it felt as if it was pushing me back, and it was making it hard to breathe. 3 steps. The wind died down immediately. The humming noise that had surrounded me had just stopped. When I opened my eyes, it was a couple of hours away from sunset, and there in front of me was the parking lot. Craig's truck was there, and to my left, a father and 2 sons, one of whom was excitedly racing to the back seat of the truck, pulling out a tackle box from underneath the seat. I was dumbfounded, and I turned around, expecting to see a black wall at the tree line. But what I was actually met with brought more tears to my eyes. I smiled. "Whoa, you okay? If you don't want to go hiking, we don't have to. I mean..." It was Craig. Happy and healthy and ready to begin our hike. It was like nothing ever happened. Not wasting another moment, I went with what he said. "Craig, I'm feeling really sick. I think we need to go home." He frowned, obviously disappointed. "Are you sure? Maybe we can wait it out and you'll feel better." Shoving my tongue in the back of my throat and forcing myself to think about everything that had happened, I was able to make myself vomit. "Okay, let's get back in the truck. We'll just go hiking another time." He helped me back to the truck. I sat in the passenger seat. Then he got in the driver's seat. His look of disappointment was worse now. I wiped my mouth and caught my breath. When I settled down, I looked at him and touched his shoulder. The same shoulder I'd latched onto when he disappeared. I told him, I'm not trying to get out of it, I promise. How's about we do something else this weekend? I think it'd be a lot of fun. Just the 2 of us." He looked at me and smiled. He seemed relieved. "Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun."